Hi, everybody. So welcome back to another lecture of Poly 130 virtual style. So this week we're going to be slightly shifting topics to talk about something that we've kind of alluded to in the past couple weeks, which is ethnicity and ethnic conflict. And this, I think, is a super interesting topic. I think the readings are very both manageable and relatable. So I hope you guys have as much fun with this topic as I tend to. But first, let's get some housekeeping items out of the way. So again, just a reminder that your midterm grades have been released. All of you should have gotten your midterm grades back if you took the midterm. And although we cannot give you back your blue books, obviously, because we can't meet in person, an answer key is available for you on Sakai. So if you are at all confused and if you have any recollection of what you put in your blue books, the answer key has sample answers for all the IDs and sample essays as well. So that should help you kind of orient your thinking and your studying as we move into the final. And I'll provide you more details in the coming weeks as to how we're going to modify the final to adapt to the online format. Another thing is that your paper topics got released last week. So if you haven't seen the announcement about that, those were released on Thursday of last week, and they're due April 13th. There's a general assignment on the the big Poly 130 on the big Poly 130 Sakai site. So if you go to assignments and you click on paper number 2, you'll be able to see the prompts for the paper. But remember that that is not where I want you to turn in your assignment. Each of your TAs should have created a specific assignment on your section website, and that is where you'll be turning in that paper assignment. Again, it's due April 13th at 11:55 p.m. So this one you have a little bit of extra time to work on it. We gave you a little bit more than 2 weeks just because I know that you guys are probably stressed and really adapting to this online schedule. Another thing that I wanted to bring your attention to is that a bonus lecture that I recorded about electoral systems has been posted. So if you'll recall, you did have readings the week that you took your midterm. And one of those sets of readings we didn't get a chance to lecture on because of the midterm, and that was the section on electoral systems for divided societies. If you have had a chance to look at the paper topics, you'll see that a lot of them have to do with divided societies, whether that be due to ethnic conflict or otherwise. So you might want to peruse that lecture and definitely do those readings, because depending on which paper topic you choose, those readings will very likely be quite helpful for you. The readings and the lecture, rather, will be quite helpful for you as you go to compose your paper. So that lecture is available on the YouTube page under the Week 9 playlist, but you should also be able to see it on the main page. And then finally, I wanted to remind everybody that I am still holding office hours. And in fact, I'm holding more office hours during this spat. Well, it's probably for the rest of the semester, but during this spate of remote instruction. So not only will my office hours be now on Wednesday, but they're also going to be on Monday from 12 to 2 p.m. They're still by appointment. So just, visit the Calendly link that you usually visit. I'll get a notification that somebody signed up for a meeting, and then I will send you a Zoom link, and we will be able to meet via Zoom on those days. So yeah, and I'm very happy to meet with anybody. Super excited to see other people during this general shutdown. So if you want to talk to me about political science, about, where you see yourself going in the major and the discipline, any internships that you want to apply for, happy to do it from 12 to 2 p.m. on Mondays and Wednesdays. Okay, so let's get into the lecture for today. So like I said, we're going into a new topic. The topic is going to be ethnicity and ethnic conflict. We're really going to deal with just general ethnic politics in this first week. And then next week, we'll be examining 3 different episodes of ethnic conflict and trying to explain them, their dynamics, etc. But this week, we're going to focus on some basic questions about ethnicity because, again, it's a new topic and we always start with the basics. So first, we're going to answer the definitional question of what ethnicity is. We're going to look at why we want to study this, like what are the effects it might have on politics. And then we want to look at how do people actually form ethnic attachments, because the theories that we have on hand as to how people view their ethnicity, how they form their ethnic attachments, has a lot to do with answering the question that we'll really deal with next week, which is how can ethnicity become mobilized into conflict, right? Why are people moving from perhaps just having simple ethnic differences to actually fighting over those differences? And how do we make ethnicity a salient topic or identity around which to mobilize and which to use conflict or violence around? So to answer the first question of what is ethnicity, this one actually has a pretty standard definition. So an ethnic group is a group of people who see themselves as united based on their shared belief in a common ancestry and typically common ascriptive traits. And so these things are really important, in particular the ancestry, right? It is possible that we could have common ascriptive traits, which are like phenotypic features, but the common ancestry has really become a big part, that we all think that we're a part of a similar heritage, that once upon a time long, long ago, we had similar relatives, etc. So these two features together create an ethnic group. And some of the ascriptive traits that we tend to think of when we think of ethnic groups are your race, your language, your religion. So are you Sunni, Shia? Are you Catholic, Protestant, etc.? Possibly customs, so cultural customs. There can be like restrictions on eating, for example, or eating certain types of foods, maybe certain types of marriage rights, things like this. Although people kind of believe that customs might be a little bit too expansive because it's not ascriptive in the way that race, language, and religion are. And some people think that region is also important. So particularly in certain places, there is a huge overlap between the region of the country that you're from and perhaps an ethnic group that lives in that region, such that region becomes a salient feature of your ethnicity. So that's also one that's up for debate, but there tends to be, at least in some countries, one of which you'll see next week, Benin, a huge overlap between where ethnic groups are placed and where they are geographically located in Benin, such that region and ethnic group are almost coincident with one another. Now, one of the things we want to do is we want to distinguish ethnicity from other terms that we've kind of run into in class, or that you might have heard in things like your AP World History class and in other classes. So one of the biggest things that gets conflated with ethnic groups are nations. And nations are in essence partially ethnic groups, right? They can be ethnic groups, but more so they are groups of people that have these unifying traits, but they also have desire to control a territory that one thinks of as their national homeland. So while we might consider the Kurds to be an ethnic group, their nation would be Kurdistan, right? This ethnic homeland that they're kind of laying claim to as their territory. They have this group with unifying traits, those are the Kurds, but their desire to control the territory of Kurdistan and carve out this space makes the nation of Kurdistan. And that should be distinguished even further from what we already know to be a state, right? A state is the human community with the legitimate monopoly over the use of force. And so the state in this case could be several, right? There's Kurds are spread across several nations, but we might consider Turkey as one, right? So Turkey is the state. Within that state, Kurdish people are laying claim to the nation of Kurdistan, and the ethnic group that lays claim to that nation then are the Kurds. So this is a good way to think of dividing this, and to think of a case where perhaps there is no nation really attached with an ethnic group. So Black Americans, right? They consist of African Americans, consist of a specific ethnic group. We don't lay claim to any particular nation that we consider our national homeland, but we exist within the state of the United States of America. So why do we even care about ethnicity? Why does it matter for politics? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I'm only going to cover three. One of the main reasons is cultural pluralism. And what cultural pluralism is right, so we can consider a case like America that we consider to be a big melting pot, right? It has a lot of different cultures in it. And one of the questions that a state like this, a multi-ethnic state, has to deal with is how is it that we are going to provide rights that feel equitable to all of the different ethnicities, right? How are we going to fairly treat and incorporate all of these people into one state, into one society? And so when we talk about cultural pluralism, it's often ways to integrate people within society while still affirming their distinct cultural identities. So one of the ways that we often see this is through language policy. This is particularly salient in recent years, 2018 till now, in a country like New Zealand. So New Zealand, obviously their dominant language, or their official language rather, is English. But there has been a big push from the native Maori communities to make Maori a language that children have to learn in school. And as recently as 2018, the Prime Minister of New England has really supported this push, although it has not been implemented in all schools. And so doing things like this, adapting the official language, making sure that languages specific to certain ethnicities are taught in schools, is one of those ways of ensuring cultural pluralism. Another way is through other legal practice, right? So in France, we have, I apologize for the, I don't know, probably a dump truck that has rolled by my house, but apologies for that noise. So in France, one of the things that the French government has to contend with is they generally have a policy of religious toleration, but it's expressed through the non-expression of their religion. They kind of want to leave religion out of the public space. And so when it comes to the number of Muslim immigrants or Muslim citizens of France, they have an issue of whether to allow French citizens who are practitioners in the Muslim religion to wear hijab, right? To wear outward signs of their faith. And so it has been a contentious policy whether they are going to allow hijab in schools, and any law that would be introduced to permit that is an example of cultural pluralism. Another reason why ethnicity might matter for politics is that some people believe that even in a multi-ethnic society, ethnic groups have objective differences, right? They have different interests, they have different preferences for policies, and so we need to figure out how we're going to manage these kind of opposing groups that really cannot seem to compromise on certain issues. And we've seen that in different points in time, right? And in different geographical regions. So in the United States, we saw in the 1950s and 60s different preferences among races, or typically within races, about whether integration was a good policy, right? Whether we should desegregate schools. And so while some sector of the white population in America was very much against desegregation, right, had a strict policy preference for separate schools, another set, Black people, were more identified with a pro integrationist policy, right, to dismantle segregation. One way in which that can become extremely contentious is when we're talking about actually dividing territory within the state or claiming statehood. And we see this in the conflicts that currently exist in Palestine and Israel, right? The groups have very different preferences on how they believe territory should be allocated, the territory that comprises Israel and Palestine, and who should have, ownership over certain territories. And so when we have to deal with these objective differences, when we have to manage these different policy preferences, that's a really big issue for politics, and politicians have to manage that, and political scientists really want to study that and see in efforts to see how those things could be resolved. And then finally, ethnic conflict becomes a really big issue. So we'll study more about ethnic conflict next week. But obviously, when violence breaks out over issues of ethnicity, they can be very deadly. Millions have died in ethnic genocides like the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide. We talked last week a little bit about Hindu-Muslim riots in India, and just kind of the human toll of these events make them particularly interesting for political scientists. Not even talking about the dynamics of those conflicts. Okay, so how do we even get these attachments to our ethnicity, right? How do these things develop and evolve? So there are 5 different theories that we're going to cover in this class trying to look at this. And those are modernization theory, which again comes up all the time in this class. We're actually going to look at some Marxist theory about this. A primordialist theory, which I'll explain what that is later, an instrumentalist theory, and an institutionalist theory. So the last 2 of these we're going to talk about next class, but we'll cover the first 3 in this lecture. So what does modernization have to say about how and why people develop these ethnic attachments and what's going to happen to them? Well, remember that modernization theory is kind of a theory of how man progresses from a traditional way of life to a more modern way of life. And if you remember the slide I had a couple weeks ago where it had traditional man on one side and modern man on the other, you'll recall that ethnicity and ethnic identity was really a feature of the traditional man. So what modernization believes is it's kind of an inherent feature of us as we are our traditional selves. That's how we get an ethnic attachment. But as we move across these kind of Rostow stages from traditional society onward to high mass consumption, right, as we develop economically, what we should see is that ethnic attachments should disappear. As we become more modern, we should be less likely to identify with our ethnicity and more likely to just kind of consider ourselves modern cosmopolitan citizens. And this is kind of borne out in the prediction made by Time magazine, right? That there would be so much as we develop ourselves economically, and in the future, there would be so much racial mixing or ethnic mixing that this is what the average citizen would look like. And you really wouldn't be able to tell someone's ethnicity, and people wouldn't really know enough about their ethnic heritage for that to be an important thing. Marx, on the other hand, offers an alternative understanding of ethnic attachments. So according to Marx, really, the main struggle that we need to focus on, Marx is kind of all about this class struggle, right? The struggle between the proletariat and the owners of capital, and how eventually we're going to get this revolution such that the proletariat will overcome the owners of capital who are exploiting them. And so since he's so focused on the class struggle, what he believes is that ethnic identity is really a false consciousness. It's something that capitalists and society has devised to kind of keep our minds off of the class struggle, right, and keep us subordinated. So if we create this false ethnic division between citizens who are in the proletariat, they won't ever be able to work together to overthrow the owners of capital. And so our ethnicity isn't something real and substantive. It's kind of created and it's false. And so what he assumes is that eventually our ethnic attachments will give way to our class identification. So we're not going to, as we begin to understand how oppressed we are, as we begin to try and revolt against this capitalist system, we're not going to care about our ethnic attachments. What we really are going to care about is our position in the economic hierarchy. And so what we should see is an image kind of like this, right, where we have a bunch of people, obviously they're, to us anyway, of different ethnicities, but they're all united together as workers, ready to battle capitalists with these knives, and I don't know, I guess that's an AR-15 or something with a bayonet. So this is kind of his futuristic version, that we'd all really not be divided by our ethnicity, but we'd be united by our proletarianism. But there are problems with these theories. One of the first problems with modernization, at the very least, is that ethnicity hasn't actually disappeared as we have progressed economically. And one of the places where we can see this borne out in data is sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a survey that is done probably every 4 years or so at this point, called the Afrobarometer Survey. And they ask a question here in this survey that helps us to understand that people still very much care about their ethnic identity. So they ask a question of whether you identify more with your ethnic or your national identity. So do you identify more as a Kenyan citizen, or do you identify as a Kikuyu, which is a tribe in Kenya? And the number of people who say that they identify at least as much with their ethnic identity as they do their national identity, or more, is quite high in a lot of these cases. So in Botswana, it's about 77%. In Liberia, it's about 71%. And even in places that we know to be very economically developed, so like South Africa, it's still 50%. So 50.9% of citizens in South Africa identify at least as much with their ethnicity, if not more, than their nationality. So these things have not seemed to wither away as countries have become more modern. More important, ethnic affiliation may have gotten a lot worse in the face of modernization. So people might be more inclined to identify with their ethnicity as we become more economically developed. And we can see some of the contours of this happening in Bolivia. So here, modernization has actually exacerbated ethnic conflict due to a fight kind of over the ownership of natural gas and oil resources in Bolivia. So natural gas resources tend to be located in indigenous areas in Bolivia. And the Bolivian state, for the longest time, right, owned these resources, obviously got the revenues from them, but never redistributed them back to these ethnic groups, like these indigenous Bolivians. And so that was a big issue around the indigenous peoples movement in Bolivia that led to the election of, yikes, I can't remember who it is. It's not Chavez. It's Evo Morales. So that led to the election of Morales. That indigenous Bolivians wanted to lay claim to the territory, and some indigenous Bolivians actually wanted to create an independent state within Bolivia in order to be able to capitalize on those resources. So clearly that's an example of where we see modernization exacerbating conflict, because as the state got more developed, as they got more revenues from these gas resources, that is when the ethnic identity of indigenous Bolivians became very salient, and they wanted to lay claim to that territory. And then the problem with Marx in particular is that sometimes our ethnic struggle actually undermines our class struggle. So we don't get this picture of tons of ethnicities united against capitalism. Sometimes we actually do see ethnicity becoming salient among people of the same class. And this happened a lot in the early 2000s. especially in places like LA and in Texas, you would see African American populations actually protesting against the liberalization of immigration laws because they were worried that Latinx um, immigrants would be taking jobs from Black citizens. And so there we see people who are still in the proletarian class, but they're battling against each other for kind of for jobs and things like this, rather than working together against capitalism. So then we need to think of other theories, right? If these predictions aren't borne out, then we need to move on to other possible explanations. And one of the main explanations that we see in political science, or one of the earliest explanations that we see in political science, rather, is this idea that ethnic attachments are primordial attachments. So what does primordialism mean? Well, it's a theory of, like I said, ethnic attachments that sees ethnicity as being natural. It's inherent to you and it's fixed. And it's really given to you by birth, right? It's always existed, and it's defined by the fact that you have different kinship, you have different language, or different phenotypical features. So here, ethnicity is something that's given to you by birth. And it's fixed and unchanging. So if I'm born a Black person, I will always be Black, and I will always have a certain set of preferences aligned with that ethnic identity that won't change. My ethnicity is always salient, so it's never not going to matter to me because it is such a primordial and inherent attachment. And the differences that I have with other ethnicities, because they were, born differently, they look different, they come from a different part of society, are going to be permanent. There's really no way to bridge the gap between those. And because of that, I'm more likely to have harmonious and cooperative relationships with people who share my ethnicity than I am from people who don't share my ethnicity. And so this is one, and like I said, it was a major theory, particularly back in the 1950s. This is how most people understood ethnicity and ethnic attachment. And even today, you see some evidence of people kind of advancing these primordialist theories and backing them up with data. So one of the kind of foundational studies about this was done in the early 2000s by Habyarimana, McCartan McHumphreys, and there's one other author whose name I can't remember. But they did a really cool experiment in which they took citizens and they paired two co-ethnic citizens and one non-co-ethnic citizen in a game, kind of in a virtual platform, and they tried to have them play different cooperative games. So the first game that they played was called the Dictator game, and the idea is that the respondent, the person who's kind of participating in the experiment, was asked to distribute a set of money, 500 of the local currency, 500 units of the local currency across three people, one of which was a co-ethnic and one of which was a non-co-ethnic. And they were given a picture like this so that they could see all of the players. Another was a puzzle game in which two respondents were to work together. Some of them were co-ethnic pairs, some non-co-ethnic pairs, to solve a puzzle together. And then the final was a network game in which the person who was taking the survey, the respondent, was tasked with finding some unknown person, right? They'd have a picture of the person in geographical space. And sometimes the person that they were trying to find was a co-ethnic, and sometimes that person was a non-co-ethnic. And so what these researchers were trying to do, all of these things involve some amount of cooperation. And so they were trying to figure out, okay, is that last kind of assertion about ethnic attachments, that ethnics are more likely to cooperate, that they have some inherent advantage at working with each other, true? And what they found through these series of experiments is there's some evidence for that. It's not terribly strong, but they found that in the Dictator game, While people in general are very altruistic, right, and give fair amounts and don't actually keep a lot of money for themselves, the people who did keep more money for themselves, right, the egoistic people is what they call them, also tended to give more money to their co-ethnics than their non-co-ethnics. So they tended to give 23 to 52 units of the local currency more to their co-ethnics than their non-co-ethnics, and that was a significant effect. Um, but this only holds when they could see the other people, when they knew, when they could visually identify one person as a co-ethnic and one as a non-co-ethnic. Another thing in the puzzle game, there was a weak, so a statistically insignificant but still positive um, uh, effect of co-ethnicity on being able to solve this game. In general, most people weren't able to solve this game, but of those who did, co-ethnic respondents were slightly more likely to significantly or successfully complete that puzzle. And then finally, in the network game, which is kind of their biggest finding in the paper, is that co-ethnic respondents are much more likely, 15% more likely to find each other than a person looking for a non-co-ethnic. So there is some type of information that co-ethnic people have about one another that makes it easier for these respondents to find people that are of their same ethnicity than people that are not of their same ethnicity. So there is some evidence of this cooperation thing, but there's still a problem with this. And some of the problems that we'll talk about more next class is that ethnic categories in a lot of places aren't fixed, right? They tend to be fluid, they tend to change over time. And it is hard, in fact, to tell co-ethnics from non-co-ethnics in a lot of societies. In a lot of places, we think, oh, we can easily identify the difference between, for example, a Black person and a white person. But in a lot of cases, so say that the main ethnic divide between people is religious, right? Can you easily tell a Catholic person from a Protestant person? Could you easily tell a Sunni Muslim from a Shia Muslim or from a Salafi Muslim? There are, of course, things that distinguish these groups in the ways that they dress, and their religious practice, but some forms of ethnicity are a lot easier to hide than others. And so sometimes it's very hard to tell. And what I want you to do, this little kind of fun game is a good way to illustrate this in the United States. So in the United States, I think we have the idea that telling people's race is very easy, right? I mean, obviously, if you were to look at me, you could tell that I am a Black woman. But PBS came up with this really cool ethnic sorting game where you're supposed to sort all of these people into different ethnic categories and try to see if you can figure out what their racial categories are. So to kind of highlight some of the problems with primordialism, what I'd like you to do as we end this lecture is go to this link. You can copy it. You can't actually click it, but go to this link and play this racial sorting game. Try and see if you can sort all of the people in this game into their correct racial categories. And then after you've done that, I want you to go to polleverywhere.com, go to the Poll Everywhere link, and actually tell me how well you did, right? Tell me how many pairs you actually got right versus wrong. And we'll put up the data on that for next class to see how well we are actually collectively at playing this game and sorting people. I think what you'll tend to find is that you're not as good at this as you think you are, and it's much harder to kind of believe in this idea that ethnicity is fixed, that it's salient, that we can identify it, that's associated with primordialism after you've played the game. So for next class, we're going to continue trying to understand ethnic politics by looking at the instrumentalist and the institutionalist explanations for ethnic identity and ethnic conflict. And then I just want you to do the readings as always. So nice talking to you. And I will, I guess, video with you next class. Talk to you later. Bye.